figured the way to beat the Beatles was to move on to the next thing. And my feeling was that the next major move was going to be comedy adventure, to take the basic adventure form, but put a twist on it.
Every single kid who grew up watching Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Can recite the villain's final line without even thinking about it. And if you're wrong about that line, that's the least surprising thing you're about to be wrong about. Because the dog was almost never the main character. The theme song almost got a different dog entirely. And the character most fans claim to hate the most is the exact reason the whole franchise didn't quietly disappear in 1980. 15 facts. 1. Great Dane. A show that was rebuilt, renamed, and rescued so many times it is a miracle it ever aired at all. Stick around, because that almost different dog gets explained coming right up, and it changes how you look at literally every episode after it. 15. A catchphrase nobody actually said. Ask anyone who grew up watching this show what the villain says at the end of every single episode, and you will get the exact same answer almost instantly, without a second of hesitation. Something about meddling kids. Here is the part that breaks people's brains a little. That exact phrase, word for word, is not the thing villains actually said in the original series. Early episodes had villains grumbling about blasted kids and their dog. Phrasing that shifted from episode to episode with no fixed script. The clean, quotable version everyone repeats did not lock into place until Season 2, Episode 20, years after the show had already been on the air. And once you know that, here is the detail that really lands. Across the entire original run, that exact phrasing is only spoken twice. Twice in a show people quote constantly, as if every single villain said it every single week. Think about that for a second. An entire pop culture catchphrase, referenced in sitcoms and memes for decades, built almost entirely on 2 lines of dialogue that most viewers never actually watched happen. The original series only ran 25 episodes total across 2 seasons, 17 in the first and 8 in the second, which makes the math even stranger. 2 lines out of 25 entire episodes somehow outlasted every other piece of dialogue in the whole run. Nobody fact-checks a childhood memory. That is exactly how a 2-line joke becomes a myth everyone repeats as gospel. 14. A rock band mystery show. Before Scooby was Scooby, before the Mystery Machine had a paint job, the entire concept was a Saturday morning knockoff of a different hit. By 1968, CBS executive Fred Silverman, running the network's entire daytime and Saturday morning schedule, was under real pressure from parent groups to tone down cartoon violence, and he had just watched a teen band cartoon called The Archie Show become a massive hit, complete with a chart-topping single that nobody expected. His answer was to copy it. 5 teenagers, a touring band, mysteries between gigs. Real names, too, before the rewrite. Jeff, Mike, Kelly, and Linda, plus Linda's kid brother. The dog was not the star. He was barely a character at all. A background bongo player named Too Much, after the hippie phrase for excess, and even his breed was up for debate behind the scenes. Writers went back and forth between making him a large, cowardly sheepdog or a large, cowardly Great Dane before settling on the Great Dane, partly just to avoid looking too much like a newspaper comic strip dog that already existed. Silverman brought the pitch to CBS under the title Who's SS Scared?, complete with storyboards and a short test animation meant to show executives exactly what the finished show would look like in motion. The network took one look at the artwork and passed. Too frightening for children, they said, and sent the whole thing back for a rewrite without a second look at the storyboards attached to it. The rock band mystery show nobody remembers today, the one with a bongo-playing sheepdog and a leader named Jeff, almost never made it past that one meeting. None of those original names survived what came next either, and the reason they got swapped out traces back to a completely different show most people have never connected to Scooby-Doo at all. 13. Recycled from another sitcom. After that rejection from CBS, the writers went back to the drawing board entirely, and instead of copying a comic book a second time, they copied a sitcom instead. The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, which had run on CBS earlier in the decade, quietly became the blueprint for every member of Mystery Inc. Fred was built on Dobie Gillis himself, the lead character constantly chasing status and girls. Velma came from the brainy, scheming Zelda Gilroy. Daphne was modeled on the glamorous, status-obsessed Thalia Menninger, and Shaggy was a near copy of Maynard G. Krebs, television's first mainstream beatnik, a goatee-wearing, work-allergic sidekick played by Bob Denver years before he ended up stranded on a deserted island in a completely different show. Even Maynard's famous flinch at the word work carried straight over, just swapped out for Shaggy, flinching at the word ghost. Parents watching Scooby-Doo in 1969 did not consciously realize it, but they were watching 4 characters they had already spent years with under different names, on a completely different network schedule, nearly a full decade earlier. There is a persistent rumor that each character was actually designed to represent a specific East Coast college, Velma for one school, Daphne for another, Fred and Shaggy rounding out the set, with Scooby somehow representing the university nearby. It sounds clever enough to believe. The creators, the original network executive, and one of the show's own writers have all directly denied it. And there is an even simpler problem with the theory. One of the supposed matching colleges did not even exist yet when the show premiered in 1969. The real inspiration was never a college campus at all. It was a sitcom rerun. 12. A name from a Sinatra scat. Somewhere between that second pitch and the show finally getting greenlit, the dog needed a real name, and the story behind it has nothing to do with dogs at all, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes it stick once you hear it. According to the writers, Silverman was on a flight, listening to Frank Sinatra's recording of Strangers in the Night, and caught the scattered line at the end of the song, "The Dooby-Dooby-Doo." He turned that into Scooby-Doo on the spot, renamed the entire show around it, and the retitled pitch finally got approved by CBS executives who had rejected the previous version outright. A cowardly sheepdog concept became a cowardly Great Dane with a name lifted from a 1966 pop song. And nobody watching on Saturday morning had any idea the show's title came from a crooner riffing on an airplane thousands of feet above the ground, with absolutely no cartoon on his mind at all. There is even a competing theory floating around among animation historians, one that points to a completely different 1960s pop song with a similar-sounding nonsense syllable in its own title, suggesting Silverman may have been remembering that instead of Sinatra without realizing it. Either way, one offhand vocal riff, borrowed by a television executive who happened to be listening at exactly the right moment, ended up naming a franchise that would still be running more than 50 years later. 11. Designed to fail on purpose. Here is where the show's single most famous visual choice gets genuinely strange once you learn how it actually happened behind the scenes. Character designer Iwao Takamoto was tasked with drawing the Great Dane, so he tracked down a co-worker who actually bred them and asked what a prize-winning Great Dane was supposed to look like. Straight back, straight legs, small chin. Takamoto listened carefully to every point she raised, then drew the exact opposite on every single one of them, deliberately, without hesitation. A sloped back, bowed legs, an oversized chin, spots in the wrong places, even the color slightly off from anything a real breeder would recognize as correct. He later said plainly that he went the opposite direction on purpose, on every single feature the breeder described to him. treating her list of ideal traits almost like a checklist of things to avoid. If Scooby had looked like an actual impressive Great Dane, the whole joke falls apart, because Shaggy can't cower behind a dog that looks brave. What almost nobody realizes is that the same artist had learned to draw years earlier in an internment camp during the Second World War, after his family was forced from their home on the West Coast, along with thousands of other Japanese-American families, then built a career at Disney working on Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Lady and the Tramp, before this one deliberately ugly dog became his most famous creation. He moved to Hanna-Barbera in the early 1960s and went on to design an entire generation of cartoon characters beyond Scooby, from Penelope Pitstop to Astro, the Jetsons' dog, years before Scooby existed, using an entirely different set of instincts for what made that particular cartoon dog work. He eventually directed an animated feature of his own, too, taking on Charlotte's Web in 1973, proving the deliberately unglamorous dog was only one small piece of a career that shaped far more of a generation's Saturday mornings than most viewers ever gave him credit for. The dog's design wasn't the only thing that almost went sideways behind the scenes. The two most famous human voices in the show almost got handed to the exact wrong characters, and the mix-up nearly stuck. 10. Two actors swapped roles. Walk into the audition room in 1969, and the two most famous voices in the entire show, the ones every kid could imitate instantly decades later, almost ended up backwards from where they landed. Casey Kasem showed up wanting to voice Fred, the clean-cut leader in the Ascot, since Kasem considered himself the straight man type, not a comedic actor. And Fred required none of the goofy energy the other roles needed. Meanwhile, Frank Welker, 23 years old and new to voice work, wanted to play Shaggy, the jittery comic relief, since he had always been cast as the serious straight man in other work, and wanted a chance to be funny for once. Both actors read for their preferred parts, on the same day, in the same room. Then the studio looked at both auditions and flipped the casting entirely. Kasem got Shaggy. Welker got Fred. Kasem later admitted, years afterward, that he had no idea what a hippie was supposed to sound like and had to figure it out from scratch, borrowing vocal mannerisms from an old radio character to get there. He figured it out well enough that the voice he built by accident, for a role he never wanted, became one of the most recognized cartoon voices of the century. A year after the show premiered, Kasem launched an entirely separate weekly radio countdown show that would go on to become one of the most listened-to programs in the country. For years afterward, the same man was simultaneously the voice counting down the nation's biggest hit songs every weekend, and the voice of a hippie who ran screaming from his own shadow on Saturday mornings. Two completely different audiences, often overlapping without ever realizing it was the same person behind both. 9. A real accident with real glasses. Velma's most famous habit, the one every parody and reference still leans on decades later, was never written into any script at all. During an early table read, voice actress Nicole Jaffe, who was genuinely nearsighted in real life, actually dropped her glasses on the table in front of everyone. Fumbling around blindly for them, she blurted out exactly what any nearsighted person would say in that moment. "Something close to my glasses. I can't see without them." The writers were in the room, heard it happen by pure accident, and immediately wrote it into the character permanently, right down to the exact panic in her voice. Jaffe voiced Velma for the original run before leaving acting entirely in 1973 to become a talent agent, and this is the part that barely anyone connects together. That same nearsighted woman who fumbled for her glasses at a table read went on to represent real Hollywood stars for the William Morris Agency, including Whitney Houston, a career built entirely away from cartoons, on the back of one unscripted accident nobody planned and nobody could have predicted would outlive her entire acting career. She stayed close enough to the role that she returned decades later for a couple of direct-to-video films, voicing the character one more time long after most of the original recording booth had scattered into completely different careers, some in music, some in radio, one in talent management, representing artists who had no idea their agent once played a cartoon detective famous for losing her glasses. 8. Same growl, different dog. If Scooby's voice has ever sounded strangely familiar from somewhere else entirely, some other show you can't quite place, that instinct is correct, and it is not a coincidence at all. Voice actor Don Messick had already created a roticized, broken speech pattern years earlier for Astro, the Jetsons' dog, back in 1962, dropping R's in front of vowels to give the character a distinct cartoon mumble that had never really been done before. When Scooby-Doo went into production 7 years later, Messick pulled out a version of that same technique and reworked it completely for a very different animal. Astro was higher-pitched and lighter, a small, nervous, futuristic pet. Scooby needed more weight, more presence, an actual physical bulk behind every syllable. So Messick dropped the pitch and thickened the delivery until it sounded, in his own words, barrel-chested. Same vocal trick, built from the same actor's toolbox, two completely different animals constructed from it 7 years apart. And most viewers watching both shows back-to-back never once clocked that connection, partly because Messick spent his career voicing dozens of other characters across the Hanna-Barbera catalog and rarely got singled out by name the way the characters themselves did. 7. One voice, two characters. Frank Welker has voiced Fred Jones in nearly every single version of Scooby-Doo made since 1969, across reboots, movies, and specials spanning multiple decades, which on its own is a remarkable streak for a 23-year-old who almost got cast as someone else entirely at that very first audition. But the real twist came decades later. After Don Messick, the original voice of Scooby, retired following a stroke in the mid-90s and passed away shortly after, the studio approached Welker about taking over the role. He was reluctant at first, unsure about stepping into a voice that belonged to someone else for so long, a voice audiences had known for over 30 years by that point, and unsure whether fans would accept anyone else in the role at all. Eventually, in the early 2000s, he took it on anyway, on top of an already massive voice acting career that by then included villains, robots, and dozens of other animals across entirely different franchises. That means the same person has been voicing both halves of the franchise's most famous double act, Fred and Scooby, for years at a time, alone, carrying two characters that used to require two separate actors in the same recording booth, trading lines back and forth with himself, take after take, switching between two completely different voices in the span of a single scene. Welker wasn't the only voice actor in this franchise who ended up somewhere nobody expected. One of his original castmates once walked away from the role entirely, over something as small as a fast food commercial, and stayed gone for years. 6. A burger commercial cost a job. In 1995, a studio reached out to Casey Kasem, the same man who had voiced Shaggy since the very first episode aired, with what looked like a simple request on paper. Voice Shaggy for a Burger King commercial, the kind of easy paycheck most voice actors would take without a second thought. Kasem, a committed vegetarian, refused outright, arguing that Shaggy's voice endorsing a meat product conflicted with his own values in a way he could not get past. The studio pushed. Kasem quit the role entirely, rather than budge an inch. Billy West stepped in to voice Shaggy for the direct-to-video film Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island in 1998, since production had already started with Shaggy eating non-vegetarian food on screen, and reworking the character mid-production was not an option. Kasem was later offered one more chance to return before that film locked, redubbing over West's already finished work, and he still refused. It took until the year 2002 and a new series called What's New Scooby-Doo for Kasem to come back, and only because the studio finally agreed to make Shaggy canonically vegetarian going forward, permanently rewriting a cartoon character's entire diet, one that had defined him for decades through absurdly oversized sandwiches and food built for shock value. Because the man behind the microphone would not compromise on a single commercial. In between, other actors carried the role through a string of direct-to-video films, each one quietly working around the absence of the voice most fans still considered the only real Shaggy. 5, 7 minutes, 2,000 drawings. Compare Scooby-Doo to an earlier Hanna-Barbera production like Tom and Jerry, produced by the very same studio just years earlier, and the difference in effort put into every single frame is genuinely staggering. Tom and Jerry needed roughly 14,000 individual drawings to produce 7 minutes of animation, every movement redrawn frame by frame for maximum fluidity. Scooby-Doo produced that same 7 minutes using somewhere around 2,000 drawings. A fraction of the labor, stretched across an entire series, week after week, season after season. The trick was reusing backgrounds, freezing character bodies while only redrawing a moving mouth during long stretches of dialogue, and sliding the same hallway painting behind characters running past it again and again during every single chase scene. A technique the studio had already been refining for over a decade across earlier shows before Scooby-Doo ever existed. One prominent animator at a rival studio dismissed the whole approach as little more than illustrated radio, cartoons you could follow with your eyes closed. A criticism that stung, coming from someone responsible for some of the most fluid animation of the era. The shortcuts caused real, visible mistakes, too. Shaggy's hair briefly turning the wrong color for a handful of frames. Scooby's spots shifting position between scenes. Characters occasionally losing an entire hand mid-gesture, or a mouth moving slightly out of sync with the words coming out of it. None of it got fixed before broadcast, because fixing it would have defeated the entire point of working this fast in the first place. And somehow, none of it mattered, because for millions of kids parked in front of the television every Saturday morning, that rough, barely holding together quality was simply what the show felt like, mistakes and all, and arguably part of why it felt so easy and comfortable to watch on repeat for decades afterward. That comfort only lasted so long, though. By the end of the 70s, the exact same formula that made the show so easy to watch had also made it easy to get tired of. And one specific decision made to fix that problem is still the most argued about moment in the franchise's entire history. 4. A catchphrase from the losing audition. By 1979, ratings were sinking fast, and Hanna-Barbera needed something drastic to inject new energy into a formula that had barely changed in an entire decade of Saturday mornings. The answer was a tiny, hyper-enthusiastic puppy named Scrappy-Doo, Scooby's nephew, built to run headfirst at exactly the kind of danger Scooby had spent 10 years running away from. Casting him turned out to be a mess. The studio's first choice turned the role down over money. Several more well-known cartoon voices were considered and passed over. During the process, Frank Welker, who had already been voicing Fred for a decade, tried out for Scrappy as well, and his audition included an ad-libbed line shouted with total enthusiasm, "Puppy Power," timed with a little fanfare noise before it. Welker did not get the part. The studio loved the catchphrase enough to keep it anyway, and hand it to whoever did land the role. That actor turned out to be Lenny Weinrib, who voiced Scrappy for the character's first season before Don Messick, who was already voicing Scooby, took over the role the following year and voiced him for most of the next decade. The most famous line the tiny puppy ever shouted, the one that ended up on lunch boxes and cereal boxes and just about every piece of merchandise Hanna-Barbera could print it on, came from a man who tried out, lost, and never got to say it on screen a single time. Scrappy himself went on to become one of the most polarizing figures in the franchise's entire history, adored by younger viewers who grew up watching him charge into danger, and quietly resented by longtime fans who felt he had elbowed the original four teenagers out of their own show. 3. Real monsters for the first time. For 3 decades straight, across every single episode and spin-off that came before this one, the entire premise of this franchise rested on one unbreakable rule that nobody dared touch. Every monster is a person in a costume, usually running some kind of scheme involving real estate, treasure, or a very elaborate insurance scam. Then, in September of 1998, Warner Brothers released a direct-to-video film called Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, and the marketing said it plainly, in exactly these words. This time, the monsters are real. The full original gang reunited for the story after a year apart, each member having drifted into a separate career once the mystery-solving lost its appeal. And by the end, the zombies really were zombies. No mask, no man named someone pretending to be undead for a real estate scam. There had technically been a supernatural spin-off a decade earlier, one built around real ghosts and monsters, but it never involved the entire original cast together in one story, so longtime fans never quite counted it as breaking the real rule. Zombie Island arrived backed by a promotional push worth tens of millions of dollars, and it sold well enough on home video that it launched an entire ongoing line of direct-to-video Scooby-Doo films that continued for years afterward. For a generation raised entirely on unmaskings, watching that formula finally break, with the actual original characters involved, rather than some side spin-off nobody quite counted as canon, felt less like a twist and more like an ending to an unspoken agreement that had lasted since 1969. That agreement existed in the first place because of decisions made decades earlier. Decisions that had nothing to do with ghosts or zombies at all, and everything to do with a nervous network trying to survive its own worst headlines. 2. A formula built from network fear. None of this show's defining creative rules came from artistic instinct alone, no matter how much the finished product feels like a deliberate style choice today. By 1968, broadcasters were under real pressure from parent watchdog groups over cartoon violence, and CBS gutted its entire lineup of punch first, ask questions later superhero shows almost overnight, canceling programs built around heroes, flinging villains through walls for entire episodes at a time, shows that had been ratings winners just months earlier, before the pressure campaign forced the network's hand. Silverman's answer, the one that eventually became Scooby-Doo, was a cast of teenagers who solve mysteries but never throw a single punch. No weapons, anywhere in the show. The closest thing to action is Fred building an elaborate trap out of rope and a bucket, and half the time it catches the wrong person anyway, usually one of his own friends. Every conflict gets resolved through logic, evidence, and a mask pulled off a very ordinary, very human criminal at the end of each episode. That one restriction, born entirely out of network anxiety rather than artistic vision, became the most copied format in the history of Saturday morning television, spawning an entire wave of shows built on the exact same nonviolent mystery structure. Josie and the Pussycats brought back the rock band angle this same franchise had originally dropped. Speed Buggy swapped the dog for a talking car. Jabberjaw and Captain Caveman leaned even further into the same low-stakes, no-punching, unmask the culprit formula. An entire genre of Saturday morning programming, built on the exact set of restrictions a nervous television network only imposed because they were scared of a few angry letters from parents. 1. The most hated character saved everything. By the summer of 1979, an entire decade after the very first episode aired, ABC was quietly preparing to cancel the show for good. A decade in, ratings were sinking fast. The format had grown stale, and the network was weighing an unnamed pilot from a rival production team as a direct replacement for Scooby's remaining time slot. Whichever show performed better in the room would get the renewal, and whichever one lost would simply disappear from the schedule entirely, with no second chance and no consolation slot anywhere else on the network. Hanna-Barbera's answer was a small, relentlessly energetic puppy who charged headfirst into every danger the older dog had spent a decade running from, a character built specifically to shake up a formula that had not changed since the first episode aired a full 10 years earlier. Scrappy-Doo made his debut that fall, and the gamble worked better than anyone expected. Ratings climbed immediately. ABC pulled the cancellation paperwork off the desk, renewed the show, and passed on the rival pilot entirely, much to the frustration of the people who had written it. The franchise picked up nearly another decade of momentum it would not have had otherwise, carrying it well into the 1980s on the back of one small, loud, universally divisive puppy. Decades later, when a live-action film cast Scrappy as an outright villain, longtime fans cheered at the choice, and nearly every reboot made since has quietly written him out of the story entirely, treating him as an embarrassment best left unmentioned. But without that one character, without that one desperate creative gamble in 1979, there is no direct-to-video era, no zombie island breaking the rules a generation grew up on, no live-action films, no franchise stretching into its sixth decade. The character everyone loves to hate, the one every reboot since has been too embarrassed to bring back, is the entire reason any of this still exists for people to make fun of in the first place. Take that away, and the timeline just stops around 1980, quietly, with nobody left to argue about it 50 years later. Which one of these 15 facts actually changed how you see the show you grew up with? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more.